Brethren, welcome to Sabbath services, and today we are going to continue in our study program. If you recall, last Sabbath we went into some detail about how to reckon the biblical calendar, and we worked out that from the scriptures we can identify that the only piece of external information we need to understand is the astronomical date of the first and the seventh month of the new moons. And if we have those two pieces of information, which we can get from any regular diary or calendar, then we can identify every one of the holy days, the high days of YHWH, the feast days. And so we spent some time working out how we could, without reference to any other man-made authority, work out the days of the feasts, which is important for us. But there's a reason we need that, and that's because we are commanded to keep the feast, the high days of YHWH. So today's message is a natural follow-on from last week. Last week we worked out how to observe and calculate the calendar. This week we are going to identify the appointed times. We said a calendar was a method by which two or more parties can keep an appointed time. So now we're going to look at what those appointed times are and why they are so significant to us in our relationship with YHWH. So let me start by reading our statement of understanding on the annual high days. The high Sabbaths were ordained by YHWH and have been observed by his people throughout history. They are a sign between YHWH and his people. All the inhabitants of the earth will be required to celebrate these feasts during the millennium. The annual feasts are a blessing and beautifully combined to reveal YHWH's plan of salvation for all mankind. So there's some fairly grandiose statements in there. There are statements that certainly are contrary to the teachings of mainstream Christianity. So let us turn to the scriptures, and as always, let us prove all things, and let us see what these feast days actually tell us. So please start by turning to the book of Ezra. This is in the Old Testament. This is one of the Chronicles. This is one of the historical books. So it's in the Old Testament. It's actually before the book of Psalms. And we'll go to Ezra chapter 3, and we will start in verse 1. Ezra 3, starting in verse 1. And when the 7th month had come, and the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered together as one man to Jerusalem. Then Jeshua the son of Jozadak, and his brethren the priests, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, and his brethren arose and built the altar to the mighty one of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as is written in the law of Moses, the man of the mighty one. Though fear had come upon them because of the people of those countries, they set the altar on its bases, and they offered burnt offerings on it to YHWH, both the morning and the evening burnt offerings. They also kept the Feast of Tabernacles, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offering in the number of the required by ordinance for each day. And afterward they offered the regular burnt offering, and those for the new moons, and for all the appointed feasts of YHWH that were consecrated, and those of everyone who willingly offered a freewill offering to YHWH. From the first day of the 7th month they began to offer burnt offerings to YHWH, although the foundation of the temple of YHWH had not been laid. They also gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, to bring cedar logs from Lebanon to the sea to Joppa, according to the permission which they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. Now in the 2nd month of the 2nd year of their coming to the house of the mighty one at Jerusalem, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, Jeshua the son of Jozadak, and the rest of their brethren, the priests and the Levites, and all those who had come out of the captivity to Jerusalem, began work, and appointed the Levites from 20 years old and above to oversee the work of the house of YHWH. Then Yeshua with his sons and brothers, Kadmiel with his sons, and the sons of Judah, arose as one to oversee those working on the house of the mighty one. The sons of Henadad with their sons and their brethren the Levites. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of YHWH, the priests stood in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise YHWH, according to the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to Jehovah, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever toward Israel. Then all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised Jehovah, because the foundation of the house of Jehovah was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and head of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this temple was laid before their eyes. Yet many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the sound was heard afar off. So here we have the story of the founding of the second temple. This was the temple that was raised after the Temple of Solomon was destroyed. And there's a number of points which are of interest, but as far as today's message, let's turn to verse 5, and let's look at what it says there. Afterwards they offered the regular burnt offering, and those for new moons, and for all the appointed feasts of Jehovah that were consecrated, and those of everyone who willingly offered a freewill offering to Jehovah. So we see there, all the appointed feasts of Jehovah. And as we discussed last week, the purpose of a calendar is for two or more parties to keep an appointment, to coordinate their activities, to do the prescribed activity at the agreed time. So these are the feasts of Jehovah. People would say, well, these are Jewish feasts, these are Jewish traditions. No, these are the feasts of Jehovah. And if we are his people, we are to do his feasts. So in verse 5, it very clearly tells us they are the appointed feast of Jehovah. And I just want to make a very, very quick segue. Today's is a long message, but I want to make a quick segue. Look at verse 6. From the first day of the 7th month they began to offer burnt offerings to Jehovah, although the foundation of the temple of Jehovah had not been laid. Now those of you who are prophecy watchers, one of the things we are watching for is the abomination of desolation. This is when the Antichrist sets himself up in the temple of Jehovah and declares that he is the mighty one. And people say, well, this can't possibly happen because the third temple hasn't been built. And they are looking for the time when, during the abomination of desolation, the morning and evening sacrifice is taken away. If we look at verse 6, it says very clearly there is biblical precedence for sacrificial worship in Jerusalem, the morning and the evening sacrifices being conducted before the third temple is built, before the temple is built. And so those who are watching prophecy and waiting for the building of the third temple could find themselves caught out, because sacrificial worship could easily occur before the temple is actually built. So that's just a point for those of us who are prophecy watching. We've said that these are appointed feasts. Now, we don't need to turn there because I'm just going to go to one verse, but in Exodus chapter 31 and verse 13 we're told this: Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily, my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am Jehovah that doth sanctify you. And look at that word Sabbath, it's in the plural. Verily, my Sabbaths. So he's talking not only about the weekly Sabbath, he's also talking about the annual Sabbaths. So if we are to be Jehovah's children, if we are to do his will, if we are to serve him as he requires, we are required to keep both the weekly Sabbath and the annual Sabbaths. They are different, but they are all required for our relationship with him. And he says further on, For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am Jehovah that does sanctify you. So if we do not observe the weekly and the annual Sabbaths, we are not exhibiting the sign of his people. It is between him and us. So it's not between him and the Jews, it's not between him and the Israelites, it's between him and those who are called by his name, those who are his people. And he says that it's also that he may sanctify us, and that concept of sanctification means to be made pure, to be made set apart. So if we are not keeping the weekly and the annual Sabbaths, we are not exhibiting the sign that he gave us, and therefore we are not his people. So today's message is quite long. We need to be fairly quick at this, and we're going to review the 7 holy days, the 7 high days, which are the feasts of Jehovah. So what I'd like to do is to start by turning to the book of Leviticus, and we'll go to Leviticus chapter 23, and I would ask you to put a bookmark. We're going to be turning back to Leviticus 23 several times during this message, so I would commend you to put a bookmark or something at that page, because we will be returning there 7 or 8 times during this message. So let's start with Leviticus 23 and verse 1. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be set-apart convocations, these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, a set-apart convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of Yahweh, set-apart convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is Yahweh's Passover, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to Yahweh. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a set-apart convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh for 7 days. The 7th day shall be a set-apart convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So here we see the first of the feasts of Yahweh. In verses 5 and 6 it tells us, In the 14th day of the first month at even is Yahweh's Passover, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread. 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread. Now when we get to this period in the spring, and this year it's in April time, we will study this in much more detail. But understand, these are Yahweh's feasts. It says in verse 5, it is Yahweh's Passover. And on the 15th day of the month is the feast of unleavened bread. So this is his feast. These are his festivals, and we are required to observe them. And it happens starting at evening on the 14th day of the first month, and the first high day is on the 15th day, in the daytime portion on the 15th day of the first month. But also notice how Leviticus 23 begins. At the end of verse 2 it says, The feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be set-apart convocations, these are my feasts. Okay? They are Yahweh's feasts. They're not the feasts for the Jews, they're not the feasts for the Israelites, they are his feasts, and they are for all people who call upon his name. And in verse 3, it identifies the weekly Sabbath as being one of his set-apart feasts. So we cannot say that we are going to worship Yahweh and keep his feasts and not keep the Sabbath. It says, 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, a set-apart convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwellings. So the very first of Yahweh's feasts is the Sabbath rest. It is the Sabbath day. And we are commanded to keep all these feasts. So in this first part of the message, we are going to look at how these feasts have been physically and prophetically fulfilled. And in the second part of this message, we're going to look at how the future feasts will be fulfilled based on Bible prophecy. So let us look at how the Passover was fulfilled. Let's go to Exodus chapter 12. So turn back just a few pages. Exodus 12, and we will start in verse 1. Now Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbour next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is Jehovah's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am Jehovah. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to Jehovah throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a set-apart convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a set-apart convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which every one must eat, and that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the 1st month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread, until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened in all your dwellings. You shall eat unleavened bread. So this is the instructions for the first Passover. And let us see what the key points were. In verse 3 it says, In the 10th day of this month they shall take to them every man a lamb according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house. So the first decision that Israel had to make was to choose a lamb on the 10th day of the month. And then in verse 6 we're told, And you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole of the assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. So Israel had to select a lamb, and this was the Passover lamb, and the blood of the lamb was going to protect them from the death angel. So let us see, is there any indication that this has been fulfilled by Yehoshua? Let's turn to the Gospel of John, and we'll go to John chapter 1, and we will start in verse 29. John 1, starting in verse 29. The next day John saw Yehoshua coming toward him and declared, Behold, the Lamb of the Mighty One, who takes away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, After me comes a man who is preferred before me, for he was before me. I did not know him, but that he should be revealed to Israel. Therefore I came baptizing with water. And John bore witness, saying, I saw the Spirit descend from heaven like a dove, and he remained upon him. I did not know him, but he who sent me to baptize with water said to me, Upon whom you see the Spirit descending, and remain on him, this is he who baptizes with the set-apart Spirit. And I have seen and testified that this is the Son of the Mighty One. Again the next day John stood with 2 of his disciples, and looking at Yehoshua as he walked, he said, Behold, the Lamb of the Mighty One. The 2 disciples heard him speak, and they followed Yehoshua. Then Yehoshua turned, and seeing them following, said to them, What do you seek? They said to him, Rabbi, which is to say, when translated, Teacher, where are you staying? He said to them, Come and see. They came and saw where he was staying, and remained with him that day. Now it was about the 10th hour. One of the 2 heard John speak and followed him, was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon, and said to him, We have found the Messiah, which is translated the Christ. And he brought him to Yehoshua. Now when Yehoshua looked at him, he said, You are Simon the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas, which is translated a stone. So we see that under the Old Testament requirements, Israel were to choose a lamb, and that lamb was to be a covering. The blood of that lamb was a covering of their sin. Here we see when Yehoshua was introduced to Israel, John the Baptist made this statement in verse 29, "Behold, the Lamb of the Mighty One, which taketh away the sin of the world." So John is telling us, this is the Lamb chosen by the Mighty One to take away the sin of the world. And in fact, if we remember the story of Abraham, when he was told to sacrifice Isaac, it said, "My son, Yehovah will choose for himself the Lamb." So we see here that this is a prophetic fulfillment of the Old Testament scripture, and Yehoshua was chosen to be that Passover lamb. Let's turn to the next of the Old Testament feasts, back to Leviticus 23, and we will look at the next of the feasts. And this is one that's often underplayed, but it is much more important than I think we give it credit for. So let's turn to Leviticus 23, and we will start in verse 9. "And Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before Jehovah, to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And you shall offer on that day, when you wave the sheaf, a male lamb of the first year, without blemish, as a burnt offering to Jehovah. Its grain offering shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering made by fire to Jehovah for a sweet aroma. And its drink offering shall be of wine, 1/4 of a hin. You shall eat neither bread, nor parched grain, nor fresh grain, until the same day that you have brought an offering to your Mighty One. It shall be a statute forever, throughout your generations, in all your dwellings." Now this one is slightly different in the fact that this is a feast of Jehovah, but it is not a designated, set-apart convocation. I think that's possibly why we underplay this feast a little bit. But it is a statute forever throughout our generations. And in verse 7 it tells us exactly what we need to do. Sorry, in verse 11. "And he shall wave the sheaf before Jehovah, to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." And this is the wave sheaf offering. This is the first sheaf of barley from the spring harvest, which is waved before Jehovah. So, did Yehoshua fulfill this feast? Is there any indication that he fulfilled this requirement of the wave sheaf offering? Well, again, let's turn back to the Gospel of John. This time we'll go to John chapter 20. And we will start in verse 17. John 20, starting in verse 17. Yehoshua said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and my Mighty One and your Mighty One." Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Master, and that he had spoken these things to her. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Yehoshua came and stood in the midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." When he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then his disciples were glad when they saw the Master. So Yehoshua said to them again, "Peace be to you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them, and said to them, "Receive the set-apart Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." So what story is this? Well, if we remember the story of Mary Magdalene, she waited around the tomb after Yehoshua was resurrected. And she was the first person to actually see him after his resurrection. And if we look at what it says in verse 17, Yehoshua said to her, "Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father." But later on, in verse 20, it said, "He showed unto them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Master." And from the scripture we read, it said, "On the same day at evening," being the first day of the week. Now, if we understand the biblical account, we know that Yehoshua was resurrected at the end of the Sabbath day. He then appeared to the disciples early in the morning on the first day of the week. He told Mary Magdalene not to touch him because he had not yet ascended. And then later that day he appeared to the disciples and showed them his hands and his side. Now, it's not explicitly stated in Scripture, but I think it is a strong or a fair inference that they would have touched him. Because remember when Thomas, doubting Thomas, came in later on, he said, "Put your finger in the holes in my hands and put your hand in my side." So Yehoshua then was quite happy to be close and have physical contact with his disciples. So what had happened between that Sunday morning when he met Mary Magdalene and Sunday afternoon? Well, logically, he had ascended to his Father. Which Sunday is that? That was the day after the weekly Sabbath, and the weekly Sabbath was the Sabbath inside the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That is also the day when the wave sheaf offering is fulfilled. The wave sheaf offering is cut and raised and waved before Yehovah on the day after the weekly Sabbath, and that's the Sabbath that occurs in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So here we see that Yehoshua literally fulfilled the wave sheaf offering. He was offered to Yehovah, he was offered up to Yehovah, and he was accepted by him. And this is an important feast because this gives us the timing point for the day of Pentecost. And if you notice in verse 22, which is at the end of this section, it says, "And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, 'Receive the set-apart Spirit.'" And if we notice, if we understand our scriptures, the next feast, which is the Feast of Pentecost, is when the set-apart Spirit was poured out. So you can see this feast begins to give us a move towards the set-apart script, towards the day of Pentecost. So we can see how these feasts lead in one to another. So let's look at the next feast. This time we'll turn back to Leviticus 23 and we'll go to verse 15. So continuing in Leviticus 23, starting in verse 15. "And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath, and you shall offer a new grain offering to Yehovah. You shall bring from your dwellings 2 wave loaves of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. They are the first fruits to Yehovah. And you shall offer with the bread 7 lambs of the first year without blemish, 1 young bull and 2 rams. They shall be as a burnt offering to Yehovah, with their grain offering and their drink offering, an offering made by fire for a sweet aroma to Yehovah. Then you shall sacrifice 1 kid of the goats as a sin offering, and 2 male lambs of the first year as a sacrifice of a peace offering. The priest shall wave them with bread of the first fruits as a wave offering before Yehovah. With the 2 lambs they shall be set apart to Yehovah for the priest. And you shall proclaim on the same day that it is a set-apart convocation to you. You shall do no customary work on it. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleaning from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am Yehovah, your mighty one." So here we see the description of the Feast of Weeks. In the Old Testament it's called the Feast of Weeks, and it says in verse 15, "And ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed." So this is obviously talking about the day of the wave sheaf offering. And it's saying seven Sabbaths shall be completed. And our understanding is that these are the weekly Sabbaths. So 7 weekly Sabbaths must complete. And the day after the 7th weekly Sabbath is when we celebrate. In the Hebrew it's called Shavuot. And in the Christian times it was called the day of Pentecost. And Pentecost merely comes from the Greek pente, 50, and kos, to count. So count 50. That's all it means in the Greek. And in verse 17 it says this, "And ye shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave loaves of 2/10 deals. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baken with leaven. They are the first fruits unto Jehovah. And here we have an interesting statement. These sacrificial offerings are baked with leaven. And we know that leaven is symbolic of false doctrine. In some circles it's more broadly interpreted as leaven being symbolic of sin, but strictly speaking, leaven is symbolic or representative for false doctrine. These 2 wave loaves are told to be baked with leaven. They are the first fruits unto Jehovah. And when we understand the symbolism, what it's telling us is these wave loaves have false doctrine. We can interpret this a number of ways. This could be for the 2 houses of Israel, Israel and Judah. It could be for the Old Testament and the New Testament church. There are many ways we can interpret these 2 loaves. But what's important is they are baked with leaven and they are still acceptable to Jehovah. It says they are first fruits to Jehovah. And so we can see here the symbolism is that on this feast day we are acceptable to Jehovah. Even though we have false doctrine, even though we have sin, we are an acceptable sacrifice as his first fruits. Although we're imperfect, we are acceptable to him even with our false doctrine, even with the sin still in us. We are an acceptable offering to him. Now, is there any indication of this being fulfilled in the New Testament time? Well, let us turn to the book of Acts. This time we'll go to Acts chapter 2, and we will see if this feast day, the Feast of Weeks, the day of Shavuot, the Pentecost, was fulfilled in the New Testament. Acts 2, and we'll start in verse 1. When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole temple where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues as of fire, and one sat upon each of them. And when they were filled with the set-apart Spirit, and began to speak with other tongues, as the Spirit gave them utterance. So, if we look at what it tells us in the Scripture, when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord, and suddenly there came from heaven as of a sound of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the house where they were sitting, and there appeared unto them cloven tongues like of fire, and it sat upon each of them. Now we know from our studies that this is the same day that the 10 Commandments were given to Israel. We know that the sound and the majesty of Jehovah, when he gave the commandments, there was the sound of the mighty trumpet, there was the rushing wind, there was the fire, there was the smoke as the mountain itself was on fire. So these are all symbolic of Jehovah reaching out and being with his people. It says in my translation, if you notice in my Bible, which I've corrected where there are translational errors, it says, and it filled the whole temple where they were sitting. And of course they would be in the temple because it's the high day. It is the Feast of Weeks. So they would have been in the temple on this day. And it said that the Ruach HaKodesh, the set-apart Spirit, came upon them. And we know from the story of the apostles and from the disciples, even after this time, they made mistakes. We know there's the story when Paul publicly rebuked Peter for slipping back into Judaic tradition. So we know that these men were not perfect. We know that they had sin. We know that they had false doctrine. But even in that condition, they were acceptable to Jehovah, and the Ruach HaKodesh, the set-apart Spirit, came upon them and started the New Testament ministry at that time. So here again we see the symbolism of the 2 wave loaves being completed at this time. So we can see that the first feast days, the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, and the Day of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, have all been physically completed and literally and spiritually completed by Yehoshua and his people. So that's all representative of the first coming and the preparation of the first fruits. Now let's look at what we call the fall feast days. And let's go into a bit more detail into the fall feast days and understand what they are and how they will be fulfilled, and see where the Bible prophecy tells us these will be fulfilled. So again, let's go back to Leviticus 23 and let us now look at the fall feast days, the feast days that we find in the fall, and see if we can discern how they will be fulfilled in the future. Leviticus 23, and we will start in verse 23. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a set-apart convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. You shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. So, this is talking about the Feast of Trumpets. And we are told on the first day, in verse 24, In the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a set-apart convocation. And in the Hebrew, this is called Yom Teruah, the day of shouting. It is what we call the Feast of Trumpets. It is the 1st day of the 7th month. It is the only feast day which falls on the new moon day, but also it has symbolic, and as we study this every year, we study the feast days, but the symbolism of the Feast of Trumpets is twofold. It announces the arrival of the king, and it's a sound of war. It's a warning for war. So let us look at the New Testament and see what we can find about blowing of trumpets. So when we look for prophecy, we will always going to go to the book of Revelation. So let's go to the book of Revelation, chapter 11, and we will start in verse 11. Revelation 11, starting in verse 11. Now after 3.5 days the breath of life from the Mighty One entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, Come up here. And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. In the same hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. In the earthquake 7,000 people were killed, and the rest were afraid, and gave glory to the Mighty One of heaven. The second woe is past, behold, the third woe is coming quickly. Then the 7th angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven, saying, The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Master and of his Messiah, and he shall reign for ever and ever. And the 24 elders who sat before the Mighty One on their thrones fell on their faces and worshipped the Mighty One, saying, We give you thanks, O Yahweh, Mighty One, Almighty, the one who is and who was and who is to come, because you have taken your great power and reigned. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come, and the time of your dead that they should be judged. And you should reward your servants the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and should destroy those who destroy the earth. Then the temple of the Mighty One was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple, and there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, and an earthquake, and great hail. So, what is this event? What are we talking about here? Well, it says in verse 15, And the 7th angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven. Now, if you understand, if you study the book of Revelation, you know that there are 3 sequences of 7s. There are the 7 seals. The 7th seal leads into the 7 trumpets, and the 7th trumpet leads into the 7 bowls of wrath. And here we see the 2 witnesses who were executed after the end of their 42-month ministry. After 3.5 days of their dead bodies laying on the earth, they were resurrected. There was the great sound, they were brought up to heaven, and then the sound of the 7th trumpet happened. Now there are other mentions in the scripture, in the New Testament, of trumpet sounds, and let's understand the significance of this, because this is really important for us as the first fruits of the New Testament. So let's turn back to the letter to the Corinthians, and we'll go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and we'll start in verse 50. Now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of the Mighty One, nor does corruption inherit incorruption. But I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last shofar. For the shofar will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. So let's look at what it says there in verse 52. in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. Now, in the book of Revelation, it talks about the 7 trumpets. We just read about at the last trump, the 7th, the angel sounded. Okay, that's when the 2 witnesses were resurrected. So here we see correlation between the book of Revelation and the book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, that at the last trump, the 7th sound of the 7 trumpets, the first resurrection occurs. The dead shall be raised incorruptible. So this is telling us that at that time, the first resurrection occurs. Okay? And we see that that is the first trumpet. But we're also told other things that happen, because remember I said the 7 seals lead into 7 trumpets, and the 7 trumpets lead into the 7 bowls of wrath. So let us turn back to the book of Revelation, and let's see how these trumpet plagues play out. Let's go to Revelation 14, and we'll start in verse 1. Revelation 14 and verse 1. Then I looked, and behold a Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his father's names written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the voice of many waters, and like the voice of loud thunder. And I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps. They sang as it were a new song before the throne, before the 4 living creatures and the elders. And no one could learn that song except the 144,000, who were redeemed from the earth. These are the ones who are not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These are redeemed from men, firstfruits to the Mighty One and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault before the throne of the Mighty One. So who are we talking about here? What are these people? Well, it says in verse 4, these are the ones who are not defiled with women, they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These are redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to the Mighty One and to the Lamb. And if you remember, we talked about Yehoshua being the first of the firstfruits. At the wave sheaf offering, he was the first of the firstfruits. He set the stage, and then at the resurrection, we see that the 2 witnesses were first, and then at the final trump, all those who were Yehoshua's at his return, the firstfruits are resurrected. So the trumpet sound, which is still to come, this fall festival, is the resurrection of the dead, the resurrection of the firstfruits, the first resurrection, and this is the resurrection of reward. It is the resurrection into spiritual life. Okay? And this is the resurrection to which we are all aspiring. Now the next feast, which happens in that same period, is again revealed to us in Leviticus 23. So it's, again, back to Leviticus 23, and we will start this time in verse 26. And Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, also the 10th day of this 7th month shall be the day of atonement. It shall be a set-apart convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls, and offer an offering made by fire to Jehovah. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the day of atonement, to make atonement for you before Jehovah your Mighty One. For any person who is not afflicted in soul on that same day shall be cut off from his people. And any person who does any work on that same day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall do no manner of work in it. It is a statute forever throughout your generations, in all your dwellings. It shall be to you as a Sabbath of solemn rest. And you shall afflict your souls. On the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Sabbath. So here we see the description of the Day of Atonement. In Hebrew this is known as Yom Kippur. And we're told, on the 10th day of the 7th month there shall be a Day of Atonement. It shall be a set-apart convocation unto you, and you shall afflict your souls, and offering an offering made by fire unto Jehovah. Now this is the only festival where we are required to fast. It is the only festival where we are to afflict ourselves. But look at the name, look at that word, the Day of Atonement. If you break that word down, you see that it's come from the English to be at one. So we can see that this being at atonement, the Day of Atonement, is at one meant with Yehovah. It is when we come close to him. But also recall that this is when we are to be afflicted. It's when our bodies are to be humbled, when our bodies are to be broken, as a sign of contrition, as a sign of personal sacrifice before him. So we can see that this is a requirement on us. And the Day of Atonement is one of the most profound, and in the Jewish understanding this is considered to be the most sacred of the days. But let us understand in a little bit more detail about this day. So turn back just a couple of pages to Leviticus chapter 16, and we will understand a bit more about this day. Leviticus 16 and verse 15. Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering, which is for the people, bring its blood into the veil. Do with that blood as you did with the blood of the bull, and sprinkle it on the mercy seat and before the mercy seat. So he shall make atonement for the set-apart place, because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel, and because of their transgressions, for all their sins. So he shall do for the tabernacle of meeting, which remains among them in the midst of their uncleanness. There shall be no man in the tabernacle of meeting when he goes in, to make atonement for the set-apart place, until he comes out, that he may make atonement for himself, for his household, and for all the assembly of Israel. And he shall go out to the altar that is before Yehovah, and make atonement for it, and shall take some of the blood of the bull and some of the blood of the goat, and put it on the horns of the altar all around. Then he shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times, cleanse it and consecrate it from the uncleanness of the children of Israel. And when he has made an end of atoning for the set-apart place, the tabernacle of meeting, and the altar, he shall bring the live goat. Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat, confess over it all the iniquities of the children of Israel, and all their transgressions concerning all their sins, putting them on the head of the goat, and shall send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a suitable man. The goat shall bear on itself all the iniquity of to an uninhabited land, and shall release the goat into the wilderness. So here we see in a bit more detail the description of the atonement ceremony, the Day of Atoning. But we see, look at the symbolism here. He shall sprinkle the blood on it with his finger 7 times, and cleanse it and hallow it from the uncleanness of the children of Israel, when he'th made an end of reconciling the set-apart place, and the tabernacle of the congregation, and the altar. Think about the execution of Yehoshua. His blood was sprayed out. When he was executed, the veil in the temple was torn in two. We were made at one with Yehovah. His blood was what cleansed us. It was only through his perfect sacrifice that we were reconciled and we were made at one. Why did he need to die? Not because of his sins, but because of the sins of the children of Israel, because of the sins of all humanity. So we can see that Yehoshua physically fulfilled this atoning sacrifice that we are required to do. But we can also see that there is a prophetic and a future requirement. So let us see how this will happen in the future. Firstly, let's turn to 1 John. And we'll go to the first epistle of John, which is right before the book of Revelation. 1 John chapter 2, and we shall start in verse 1. My little children, these things I write to you, so that you may not sin. And if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Yehoshua the Messiah, the righteous. And he himself is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the whole world. Now by this we know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. He who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, truly the love of the Mighty One is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in him. So in verse 2 it says, and he is the propitiation of our sins, and not only for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. And think about the blood of the atonement sacrifice. It was to take away the sin of Israel. It was for the sins of Israel. Yehoshua was for the sin of Israel and for the sin of the whole world. That word propitiation means that he takes away. It's his sacrifice that does away with that sin. So we can see here that Yehoshua is the propitiation sacrifice. He fulfills the atoning sacrifice. His execution was part of this symbolic fulfillment of these annual high days. But there's also a prophetic requirement. And as we see, as Yehovah comes to the end of his plan, as he comes to the end of these high days, he gives us a very clear statement as to his intention for the world and humanity. So let's turn forward into the book of Revelation, and let us go to Revelation chapter 15, and we will start in verse 1. Revelation 15, starting in verse 1. Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvellous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them the wrath of the Mighty One is complete. And I saw something like a sea of glass mingled with fire, and those who have the victory over the beast, over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, having harps of the Mighty One. They sing the song of Moses, the servant of the Mighty One, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvellous are your works, Yehovah, Mighty One Almighty. Just and true are your ways. O King of the worlds, who shall not fear you, O Yehovah, and glorify your name? For you alone are set apart. For all nations shall come and worship before you, for your judgments have been manifested. After these things I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. And out of the temple came the 7 angels, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen, and having their chests girded with the golden bands. And one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls, full of the wrath of the Mighty One, who lives for ever and ever. The temple was filled with smoke from the glory of the Mighty One and from his power, and no one was able to enter the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, Go, and pour out the bowls of the wrath of the Mighty One on the earth. So in verse 16 we see this, Go your ways, and pour out the vials of the wrath of the Mighty One upon the earth. Now think about the symbolism. We are required to afflict our souls. As part of our sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, we are to afflict ourselves. If we choose to do that, if we demonstrate to Yehovah our obedience, he will accept us as his first fruits, even with sin, even with the leavening of false doctrine, even in our weakness, he will accept us into his family. But for those who reject him, those who refuse to go his way, he will ultimately impose his will on them. Just as he did at the Passover, those who humbled themselves before him with the sacrificial offering of the lamb and covered the doorposts and the lintels with the blood of the sacrificial lamb, they were protected. Those who rejected him, those who did not do that, suffered the punishment, in this case the death of the firstborn. So we see here that Yehovah gives us time and chance to prepare to do his will. But there comes a time when he says, enough is enough. There's a scripture that says, let the just be just and let the wicked remain wicked. So we are coming to that time when the time for us to voluntarily worship Yehovah and do his will is coming to an end. And after that he will impose his will on all of humanity. But also notice what it said in verse 8. The temple was filled with the smoke of the glory of the Mighty One and from his power, and no one was able to enter the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels was completed. Now what is the very next feast after the Day of Atonement? Well, let's turn back to the book of Leviticus. This time we'll go to Leviticus 23, and we will start in verse 33. And Yehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles, for 7 days to Yehovah. On the first day there shall be a set-apart convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to Jehovah. On the 8th day you shall have a set-apart convocation, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to Jehovah. It is a sacred assembly, and you shall do no customary work on it. These are the feasts of Jehovah, which you shall proclaim to be set-apart convocations, to offer an offering made by fire to Jehovah, a burnt offering and a grain offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, everything on its day. Beside the Sabbaths of Jehovah, beside your gifts, beside all your vows, and beside all your freewill offerings which you give to Jehovah. Also on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of Jehovah for 7 days. On the first day there shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day a Sabbath rest. And you shall take for yourselves of the first day of the fruit of beautiful trees, trees of palm branches, the boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before Jehovah your mighty one for 7 days. You shall keep it as a feast to Jehovah for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute for ever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. Those who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths, when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am Jehovah your mighty one. So Moses declared to the children of Israel the feasts of Jehovah. So, the 7th feast is this. The 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto Jehovah. On the first day shall be a set-apart convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. So the 7th feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, is on the 15th day of the 7th month. It comes immediately after Atonement. Look at what happened on Atonement. The sacrifice was for the atoning of the tabernacle, of the holy place, of the set-apart place. We are told in the book of Revelation, nobody can enter into the temple until those bowls of wrath, until that affliction has been poured out on the earth. So Jehovah here is preparing all of humanity to enter into this feast day. So we see this as being very much a requirement of Israel. We know it's one of the annual high days. We know it's the culmination of the Feast of Jehovah. But let's also look at how this affects us prophetically. Let's turn to the prophet Zechariah, and let us understand how these are prophetically going to be fulfilled. Zechariah chapter 14, and we'll start in verse 16. And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came up against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, Jehovah of hosts, and keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whoever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, Jehovah of hosts, on them there will be no rain. If the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague with which Jehovah strikes the nations, who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Thus shall be the punishment of Egypt, and the punishment of the nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So, we know from Zechariah, from reading the whole chapter, that this is very much an end-time prophecy. We know that this is after the great battle for Jerusalem. And we see in verse 18, we are told this: if the family of Egypt go not up and come not, that have no rain, there shall be plague, wherewith Jehovah will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So Jehovah expects all the earth to worship him on his feast days. Jehovah is fulfilling his feast days. On the Day of Atonement we are commanded to afflict our souls. If we will not do it voluntarily, in the time of the end he will impose his will on the people of the earth, and by pouring out the bowls of wrath he will afflict them, and he will bring them to observe his feast days. Now, we are told, if you remember what it said in Leviticus 23, we're told it's a time of rejoicing. We're told it's a time of leafy trees and boughs and festivals. But why would this? Because Yahweh is going to pour out plagues on those who don't come to worship. What is special about this Feast of Tabernacles? Well, let's turn forward in the New Testament. This time we're going to go to the Gospel of John. And we'll go to John chapter 1. And we will start in verse 14. Gospel of John chapter 1 and verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness of him and cried out, saying, This is he of whom I said, He who comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace. But the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Yehoshua the Messiah. No one has seen the Mighty One at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. So again, what did John the Baptist tell us? Verse 14. What did the Apostle John tell us? Verse 14. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now what's this got to do with the Feast of Tabernacles? Well, if you notice on the screen there, that word dwelt is the Hebrew word skaino, and the Greek word skaino, and it means to dwell. If you look at the bottom there, it says the second translation is to dwell. But look at the first translation. It says this: to fix one's tabernacle, to have one's tabernacle abide, or to live in a tabernacle or tent, to tabernacle. So we can see here that it says Yehoshua came, and if we'd have used the regular translation, again, this could be that the translators were trying to hide the Hebrew or the Old Testament inferences here by deliberately choosing to use the word dwell rather than tabernacle. But we can just as correctly render that verse as follows: And the Word was made flesh and tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory, as the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word was made flesh and tabernacled amongst us. And so here we see again this relationship between Yehoshua, the feast days, and coming in the flesh and tabernacling with his people. In the wilderness, Yehovah had his seat, had his throne in the tabernacle wilderness. In the future, after the resurrection, he will tabernacle amongst us. We see that the Feast of Tabernacles is the culmination of the annual feast days. And let us look at the prophetic statements that relate to this. Let's turn again to the book of Revelation, and let us look at the prophetic statements relating to this period. Revelation 7. And we will start in verse 1. And after these things I saw 4 angels sitting on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, and the wind should not blow on the earth or on the sea or on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living Mighty One. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our Mighty One on their foreheads. And I heard the number of those who were sealed. 144,000 of the tribes of all the children of Israel were sealed. Of the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Gad, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Asher, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Simeon, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Levi, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Issachar, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Joseph, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000 were sealed. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our Mighty One, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. All the angels stood around the throne, and the elders and the 4 living creatures, and fell on their faces before the throne, and worshipped the Mighty One, saying, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom, thanksgiving and honour and power and might be to our Mighty One for ever and ever. Amen. Then one of the elders who answered, saying to me, Who are those arrayed in white robes, and from where did they come from? And I said to him, Sir, you know. So he said to me, These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of the Mighty One, and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will dwell with them. They shall neither hunger any more, nor thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them, and lead them to living fountains of water. And the Mighty One will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And so we see here, this is the 2 groups who are coming out of the tribulation at the end time. The 144,000 who are sealed and protected from the tribulation, and the great multitude who actually die during that tribulation period, but are resurrected in the first resurrection to serve Yehovah and to sit in his temple. And so we see again this prophetic statement that they will tabernacle with him. And it says in verse 15, They are before the throne of the Mighty One, and serve him day and night in his temple. And he that sitteth on the throne shall dwell among them. So just as we saw Yehoshua dwell among us and tabernacle with us, we see the symbolism that we shall dwell with him. We shall be invited into the tabernacle, into his throne. And so the plan of Yehovah is being made clear. In the end, we shall enter into the very temple and the very throne of the Mighty One as his children, as invited guests. And Revelation 20 carries on that thought. If you notice at the end of that statement there, it said, And the Mighty One will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So let's continue into Revelation 20 and see how this comes to culmination. Revelation 20 and verse 1. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more, till 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a little while. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Yehoshua and for the word of the Mighty One, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their forehead or on their hands. And they lived and reigned with Messiah for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and set apart is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power. But they shall be priests of the Mighty One and of Messiah, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. So we can see here that the first part of this resurrection process is for the saints, those who are judged worthy, those who are resurrected as spirit beings to live with Yehovah and Yehoshua. And it says in verse 4, I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Yehoshua, for the word of the Mighty One, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, nor had received his mark upon their foreheads or on their hand. And they lived and reigned with Messiah 1,000 years. The first resurrection is for those who choose to do his will. It is a resurrection to kingship and priesthood and authority, to live in the temple, to reign with Yehoshua for 1,000-year period. And so that is the offer that is laid out to all mankind. But there is a second part to this story, and we need to look carefully, because we often overlook this feast day. We often underplay this feast day. And just as I believe that the Feast of Weeks has been underplayed, so also I believe that this feast has been underplayed. Let's go back again to Leviticus 23, and let us look at verse 33. Leviticus 23 and verse 33. Then Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to Jehovah. On the first day there shall be a set-apart convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to Jehovah. On the 8th day you shall have a set-apart convocation, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to Jehovah. It is a sacred assembly, and you shall do no customary work on it. Now historically we have grouped those two festivals together and just called the whole thing the Feast of Tabernacles. But if you look carefully, we're told that the Feast of Tabernacles, in verse 36 says, 7 days shall ye offer an offering made by fire to Jehovah. So the Feast of Tabernacles starts on the 15th day of the month and lasts 7 days. That is the definition of the Feast of Tabernacles. And that parallels the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, it's we start the year with a 7-day festival, we finish the year with a 7-day festival. We've seen time and time again in this study the completeness of 7. 7 weeks of 7 days shall be completed. You shall count 7 Sabbaths for yourself. This concept of 7 being the completion of Jehovah's plan, the number of completeness. And if we include the Feast of Weeks, we actually have 7 festivals. Unleavened Bread, Weeks, the Feast of Weeks, the Day of Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And so that with Passover gives us 7 festivals. So this 8th day is outside that period of completeness. But it is a clearly separate event. It says, On the 8th day shall be a set-apart convocation unto you, and you shall offer an offering made by fire. It is a solemn assembly, you shall do no servile work therein. It is a high day, it is a set-apart convocation, but it is the beginning of something new. The 7 festivals that bring us to the Feast of Tabernacles is the complete cycle. It is the beginning, it starts with a 7-day festival, it ends with a 7-day festival. This is the beginning of a new sequence, it's the beginning of a new series. It is outside of that main sequence. And so let us understand what this truly means. Let's understand the symbolism of this 8th day. So turn please back with me to the book of Revelation, back to Revelation 20. And this time we'll start in verse 7, and we will understand this symbolism of the 8th day, the day that comes after the Feast of Tabernacles. Now when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison, and will go out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. They went up on the breadth of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from the Mighty One out of heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne on it, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before the throne. And books were opened, and another book was opened, which is of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, by the things that were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the set-apart city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from the Mighty One, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of the Mighty One is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. The Mighty One himself will be with them and be their Mighty One. And the Mighty One will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. So what do we see here? In verses 3 and 4 it tells us, Behold, the tabernacle of the Mighty One is with men, and he will dwell with them. Again we see this reference to the Feast of Tabernacles. But we're now talking about the new cycle, and it says, They shall be his people, and the Mighty One himself shall be with them and be their Mighty One. And the Mighty One will wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, neither shall be any more pain, for the former things have passed away. So this 8th day of the feast, or the 8th day, the 8th festival, symbolizes the beginning of the new cycle. We have the period to the end of the Feast of Tabernacles. We have that 7th festival, which completes the earthly cycle. Then there is the time of the second resurrection, the time of judgment. And then it says, And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the former ones had passed away. And when we live with Yehovah, we are now living, all of humanity is living as spirit beings with Yehovah as he starts the next cycle of creation, the next cycle of existence. So the feast days of Yehovah, the high days of Yehovah, the annual holy days, foretell, they give us the description as to how all of humanity will be given the opportunity to be saved, how those who accept him in this physical earth will receive the reward of kingship and priesthood, how there will be a final chance for those who reject him in this physical life. They will have the second resurrection. They will have a period when their works will be tested, and if they accept him at that time, then they will enter into the new creation, into the new state, to live as spirit beings for eternity with Yehovah. So why is it important that we understand the high days? Because it gives us hope, it gives us understanding, and it gives us the chance to know the mind of Yehovah and the great blessing that he has put before all of humanity. Amen.